Dakota Territory, 1880. While every settler raced to throw up the quickest cabin before winter, Norwegian immigrant Lars Halvorsen was still building in late September, routing his stovepipe through a sealed attic instead of straight through the roof like everyone else. His neighbors called it wasteful. Local carpenter Caleb Turner warned it would burn the place down or poison his family with smoke. Lars built thick plank ceilings and filled his attic with controlled smoke, while others left their roofs cold and drafty. He spent 2 months on what others finished in 3 weeks. Then October 15th arrived. The first blizzard of the hard winter hit without warning. 3 feet of snow, winds howling at 40 miles per hour, temperatures plunging toward 20 below zero. Through the brutal months that followed, standard cabins with proper chimneys struggled to stay above freezing. Families burned through cord after cord of precious firewood just to survive. But that smoke-filled attic? On the coldest night of winter, with both cabins burning identical amounts of wood, Caleb Turner's proper cabin dropped to 32 degrees, while Lars's foolish design held steady at 57 degrees. A 25-degree difference that meant the gap between misery and comfort, between burning furniture to stay alive and sleeping soundly through the storm. What did this Norwegian immigrant understand about heat, smoke, and thermal mass that established frontier wisdom completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The spring of 1880 brought a steady stream of homesteaders to the rolling prairie of Dakota Territory, each family clutching their 160-acre claim and the hope that this year's crop would justify the gamble. Among them, Lars Halvorsen stepped off the train at Yankton with calloused hands that knew Norwegian timber and a memory full of smoke-blackened rafters from his grandfather's turf-roofed house on the western coast. Unlike the Iowa farmers and Ohio carpenters spreading across the territory, Lars carried no faith in the quick, straight chimneys that marked American prosperity. He had spent too many winters watching his grandfather's meat hang in the smoky loft above their central hearth, curing slowly in the controlled haze that kept the old house warm from floor to peak. By May, when the prairie grass stood knee-high and green, Lars had walked his claim boundaries and chosen his site, a gentle rise with good drainage and timber access to Antelope Creek. His neighbors, the Sorensens from Iowa, had already cut and stacked their cabin logs in the standard frontier pattern, 16 by 20 feet of 8-inch oak, chinked tight, with a stone chimney rising straight and tall through a simple gable roof. Caleb Turner, the settlement's acknowledged expert on proper building, had helped them lay out the standard design that every successful farmer from Ohio to Nebraska trusted: single room, strong draft, cold but well-ventilated loft space, and a chimney that carried smoke away fast and clean. Lars studied their work and quietly planned something different. When he began cutting his foundation logs in June, settlers noticed the odd dimensions: 18 by 24 feet, nearly a third larger than practical sense demanded. When he notched his wall logs with the careful saddle joints his grandfather had taught him, using 9-inch pine instead of the standard 6 or 7, neighbors shook their heads at the waste of good timber. When he framed his loft at 8 feet above the floor instead of the usual 6, creating a tall attic space under a steep 12-to-12 roof pitch, Caleb Turner finally spoke up. "Man's building a cathedral instead of a cabin," Turner announced at the settlement's weekly gathering. "All that extra timber and work, just to have more cold air above your head come winter. Smoke needs to get out fast and clean, not hang around in some oversized attic making creosote and fire risk." Turner's authority came from 2 decades of building across Iowa and Minnesota, where his straight chimneys and proper ventilation had kept families safe through ordinary winters. He had seen cabin fires start in poorly maintained flues and knew that smoke belonged outside, not pooling under rafters like some medieval hovel. When Lars began laying heavy plank boards across his loft joists, sealing the ceiling tight instead of leaving gaps for air circulation, Turner's warnings grew sharper. "You're making a smoke trap up there," he told anyone who would listen. "First hard freeze. That family's going to suffocate on their own chimney or burn to death when all that creosote catches fire." But Lars continued his work with the patient persistence of a man following proven logic. He had grown up hearing his grandfather explain the smoke loft principle in practical terms that needed no technical language. Hot air rises and wants to stay high if you let it. Smoke that lingers near the roof warms the whole structure before it leaves. Meat that hangs in controlled smoke stays good through the hardest winter. These were not theories, but observed facts from generations of coastal Norwegian builders who had kept families alive through storms that lasted weeks. The real controversy began in late July when Lars installed his heating system. Instead of running his iron stove pipe straight up through the roof like every other settler, he routed it horizontally through a steel-lined box in his loft floor, then into a larger sheet metal chamber in the attic, where the pipe expanded briefly before turning toward a small 6-inch vent at the gable end. The neighbors watched in amazement as he created what looked like a deliberate smoke chamber directly above his living space. "That's not a chimney, that's a death trap," Caleb Turner declared, pointing to the horizontal run of pipe and the modest vent opening. "Smoke needs a tall, straight draw to pull proper. You're asking for backdraft and suffocation." The Sorensen family, whose own cabin sat just 200 yards away, began to worry about the fire risk. Danish immigrants themselves, they understood the appeal of old-world methods, but they had seen American frontier efficiency work reliably for thousands of families. Their cabin, built to Turner's specifications, featured a solid brick chimney that drew smoke cleanly through an 8-foot interior rise and another 6 feet above the roof peak, creating the strong updraft that every successful homesteader counted on. Lars acknowledged their concerns with the quiet politeness of a man who had made his decision based on hard experience. He explained that his grandfather's house had used a similar system for 50 years without incident, warming not just the living area but the entire structure through what he called making the roof work instead of waste heat. He showed them the steel lining and careful masonry work that would prevent creosote fires, and the strategic placement of his smoke vent to avoid downdrafts. Most importantly, he demonstrated how the sealed ceiling would keep living smoke above breathing height, while still allowing heat to radiate down through the warm planks. By September, when early frost warned of the coming winter, Lars had completed his smoke attic system and begun hanging the first sides of pork and racks of fish in the dim aromatic chamber above his ceiling. The meat would cure slowly through the fall months, preserved by the constant low-level smoke that would keep the attic at a steady 90 to 120 degrees once regular heating began. His neighbors watched this process with a mixture of curiosity and concern, noting how different it looked from their own cold, empty lofts, where winter gear and supplies waited in the dry, unheated space above their living areas. The first test came with October's unexpected blizzard, when 3 feet of snow and howling wind caught half the settlement still finishing their winter preparations. As families huddled around their stoves and fed precious firewood to their heating systems, two very different approaches to frontier winter survival faced their initial trial by ice and wind. The blizzard struck on October 15th, with a ferocity that caught even veteran plainsmen off guard. What began as scattered flurries at dawn became a wall of wind-driven snow by noon, with gusts reaching 40 miles per hour and temperatures plunging from a mild 50 degrees to near zero in less than 6 hours. Settlers who had planned to spend the day finishing their winter preparations found themselves battening down hatches against nature's first serious challenge of what would become known as the hard winter. By evening, snow had piled 3 feet deep against cabin walls, and the wind showed no sign of us letting up. Families gathered around their heating stoves, feeding split oak and cottonwood into fireboxes that glowed cherry red against the howling darkness outside. In the Sorensen cabin, built to Caleb Turner's proven specifications, the family huddled close to their iron stove while cold drafts found every gap between the logs and whistled through the ventilated loft space above their heads. The brick chimney, rising 14 feet from firebox to peak, drew strongly in the wind, pulling heated air up and out so efficiently that the family could feel the heat being sucked away from the room, even as they fed log after log into the flames. 200 yards away, Lars Halvorsen's family experienced the same storm from inside their controversial smoke attic design. As wind hammered their cabin with equal force and snow piled against their walls to the same depth, the Halvorsen children played on the floor in shirt sleeves, while their parents tended a smaller fire, that somehow seemed to warm the entire space more effectively. Above their heads, the sealed plank ceiling radiated gentle heat downward, warmed by the smoky air that circulated slowly through the attic before finding its way out the modest 6-inch vent at the gable end. Curious about the difference he could sense even from outside, Caleb Turner knocked on the Halverson door near midnight, ostensibly to check on their welfare during the storm. What he found inside challenged everything he thought he knew about heating a frontier cabin. While his own family wore coats and heavy blankets around their roaring stove, the Halverson living room felt genuinely comfortable in ordinary indoor clothing. When Lars showed him a mercury thermometer reading 62 degrees 4 feet above the floor, Turner could hardly believe the measurement. "That can't be right," Turner muttered, comparing it mentally to the 48 degrees he had measured in his own cabin, despite burning twice as much wood. "How much fuel are you going through?" Lars led him outside to examine both wood piles in the howling wind. The Sorensen and Turner families had each burned through roughly 50 pounds of split hardwood since the storm began, feeding their hungry stoves at 20-minute intervals to maintain any warmth at all. The Halverson pile showed perhaps 30 pounds consumed over the same period, with coals still glowing steadily in a firebox that seemed to require attention only every 40 minutes or so. The difference became even more apparent when Turner borrowed a second thermometer to conduct a direct comparison. Both families agreed to burn identical 40-pound loads of split oak through the night, measuring interior temperatures at the same height and location in each cabin. Turner's scientific approach reflected his practical nature. If the smoke attic really worked better, he wanted to understand why, even if it violated every principle of proper chimney design he had learned. As the night wore on and the storm reached its peak intensity, the measurements told a story that Turner found difficult to accept. His cabin, with its properly drawing chimney and well-ventilated roof space, peaked at 55 degrees near the stove, but averaged only 45 degrees throughout the room. By dawn, with only coals remaining in both fireboxes, his interior temperature had dropped to 38 degrees, cold enough that water left in cups had formed thin ice. The Halverson cabin told a different story entirely. Peak temperatures near their stove reached 68 degrees, but more importantly, the heat distributed evenly throughout the room, with the sealed ceiling acting like a radiator that continued warming the air long after the fire had died to coals. When Turner took his final measurement at sunrise, Lars's cabin still registered 59 degrees, a 21-degree difference that represented the gap between sleeping comfortably under blankets and shivering through the night fully dressed. The explanation, as Lars patiently described it, lay in the behavior of hot air and thermal mass. In Turner's cabin, heated air rose directly into the cold loft space and escaped through the efficient chimney, carrying most of the fire's energy outside before it could warm the living area. The brick chimney itself, exposed to outside air along most of its height, acted as a heat sink that drew warmth from the room. Meanwhile, the Halverson design captured hot air in the sealed attic where it circulated slowly, warming the entire roof structure before gradually escaping through the small vent. The ceiling planks, heated by the smoky air above, radiated warmth downward for hours after the fire had reduced to coals. Turner examined the attic space with a mixture of professional curiosity and personal discomfort. The smoke-filled chamber above the Halverson ceiling maintained a steady temperature near 110 degrees, with sides of bacon and racks of fish hanging in the aromatic haze. The rafters showed the telltale blackening of smoke exposure, and the air carried the sharp tang of wood smoke mixed with curing meat, conditions that violated every principle of clean, well-ventilated construction Turner had learned. Yet the system clearly worked, not just for heating, but for food preservation in a region where supply lines could be cut for months at a time. As morning brought a temporary lull in the storm, other neighbors began to notice the difference. The Sorensens, whose cabin sat between the two experimental designs, had endured a miserable night of constant stoking and poor heat retention. When they learned about Turner's measurements, practical curiosity overcame theoretical doubts. If the Norwegians' unorthodox methods really delivered 20 degrees of additional warmth for less wood consumption, the implications extended far beyond one family's comfort. The storm continued intermittently for 3 more days, providing an extended test of both heating systems under identical conditions. By the time clear skies returned, Turner had filled a notebook with temperature readings, fuel consumption figures, and reluctant observations about the superior performance of a design he had dismissed as dangerous foolishness. The smoke attic had demonstrated not just adequate performance, but clear superiority in the two metrics that mattered most for frontier survival: heat retention and fuel efficiency. Word of the comparison spread through the settlement with the speed of all-important news in isolated communities. Families who had mocked Lars's extravagant building methods now found themselves reconsidering the relationship between chimney design and winter survival. The first real test had produced measurable results that no amount of conventional wisdom could explain away, setting the stage for harder trials that lay ahead in the months of deep cold still to come. January brought the kind of cold that tested every joint, chink, and heating system across the northern plains. By mid-month, the thermometer outside Caleb Turner's cabin had not risen above zero for 12 straight days, and night temperatures regularly dropped to 20 below, or worse. The railroad line from Yankton had been blocked by snow and ice for 3 weeks, leaving the settlement completely isolated with whatever supplies families had managed to stockpile through the fall. Firewood piles that had looked adequate in November now appeared desperately small against the relentless demand of heating systems fighting temperatures that froze breath and turned cabin walls into sheets of ice on the inside. The crisis deepened on January 22nd when a massive cold front swept down from Canada, bringing with it winds that howled at sustained speeds of 30 miles per hour and temperatures that plunged toward 30 below zero. Settlers who had grown confident in their ability to survive prairie winters found themselves facing conditions that pushed every cabin, every heating system, and every family's endurance to the breaking point. Even prosperous households with ample firewood stores began rationing fuel, burning only enough to keep water from freezing solid and family members from suffering frostbite in their own homes. Turner had spent the weeks since October's blizzard quietly modifying his own cabin's heating system, adding a tight plank ceiling and repositioning his stovepipe to capture more heat before it escaped up the chimney. His improvements had yielded measurable gains in heat retention, but nothing approaching the performance gap he had documented at the Halverson place. As the extreme cold settled over the settlement, he proposed a definitive test that would settle the question of heating efficiency once and for all. On the night of January 24th, with outside air holding steady at 22 below zero and winds gusting to 40 miles per hour, Turner and Lars agreed to conduct a controlled comparison using identical conditions and precisely measured fuel loads. Both men weighed out 50 pounds of seasoned oak splits from the same woodpile, lit their fires at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, and placed mercury thermometers at identical heights in the center of each living space. Turner's wife recorded temperatures in their cabin, while Lars's eldest son maintained the log for the smoke attic design. As the night progressed and both families fed their carefully rationed fuel to glowing fireboxes, the temperature readings revealed the full magnitude of difference between conventional and smoke attic heating systems. Turner's cabin, despite his recent improvements, peaked at 52 degrees near the stove while the fire burned hotly, but the heat dissipated quickly into the cold loft space and up the efficient chimney. By midnight, with half the wood consumed, interior temperature had dropped to 45 degrees. The brick chimney, conducting cold from outside through its entire mass, acted as a thermal drain that pulled warmth from the room, even as the fire continued to burn. The Halverson cabin demonstrated an entirely different thermal behavior. Peak temperatures near their stove reached 67 degrees, but more significantly, the heat distributed evenly throughout the living space as warm air circulated through the sealed ceiling into the smoke-filled attic above. The ceiling planks themselves became radiating surfaces, warmed by the 120-degree air that circulated slowly overhead before finding its way out through the small vent at the gable end. By midnight, the Halverson thermometer still read 61 degrees, despite burning an identical fuel load under identical conditions. The true test came in the pre-dawn hours when both fires had reduced to glowing coals, and the bitter cold outside reached its most penetrating intensity. Turner's cabin, with its cold loft and efficient heat removal system, dropped steadily toward the freezing point as the last heat from dying coals raced up the chimney and out into the night. By 5 in the morning, his thermometer registered 34 degrees, cold enough that the family's wash water had begun forming ice crystals, and everyone slept fully clothed under multiple layers of blankets. At the same hour, in the smoke attic cabin just 200 yards away, the Halverson family slept comfortably under normal bedding while their thermometer held at 57 degrees. The ceiling continued to radiate stored heat downward, warmed by the thermal mass of the entire roof structure that had absorbed and now slowly released the energy from hours of hot air circulation. The 23-degree difference represented more than mere comfort. It marked the line between a heating system that worked with the building's thermal properties and one that fought against them. Turner documented every measurement with the methodical precision of a man whose professional reputation depended on understanding why one design succeeded where another failed. The smoke attic had demonstrated not just superior heat retention, but dramatically improved fuel efficiency, achieving higher interior temperatures while consuming no more wood than his conventional system. More troubling for his engineering principles, the design accomplished this efficiency by violating fundamental rules about smoke removal and chimney draft that he had considered non-negotiable for safe construction. As dawn broke on January 25th, revealing a landscape transformed by hoarfrost and ice fog that marked one of the coldest nights on record, Turner found himself confronting evidence that challenged 2 decades of building experience. The controlled test had eliminated every variable except heating system design, yet the results showed performance differences that could mean the difference between survival and death for families with limited fuel supplies. The implications extended beyond personal comfort to community survival. Families like the Sorensens, who had stretched their firewood supplies through careful rationing, faced the possibility of burning furniture, outbuildings, and fence posts to maintain minimal heat through the remainder of winter. Meanwhile, the Halverson family's efficient system allowed them to maintain comfortable interior conditions while consuming significantly less fuel, leaving them with reserves that could last through extended cold or even support neighbors whose less efficient cabins had exhausted their wood supplies. Word of the documented 23-degree difference spread through the settlement within hours, carried by neighbors who had observed the test conditions and witnessed the morning measurements. Families who had dismissed the smoke attic as an eccentric curiosity now found themselves calculating whether such a system could extend their own fuel supplies through the months of cold that still lay ahead. The extreme conditions had transformed an academic question about heating efficiency into a practical matter of winter survival, forcing the entire community to reconsider assumptions about proper construction that had seemed unshakable just months before. February arrived with blizzards that buried the settlement under drifts higher than cabin roofs and railroad cuts packed solid with ice that would not clear until late March. Supply trains that normally brought flour, salt pork, and other winter necessities had not reached the territory in 6 weeks, leaving families to survive on whatever they had managed to preserve through the fall harvest season. For most settlers, this meant stretching dwindling stores of grain and dried vegetables while rationing the last of their purchased meat supplies. The Halverson family faced the same shortages with one crucial difference. Their smoke-filled attic had been curing ham, bacon, and fish since September, creating a substantial reserve of preserved protein that other families lacked. The crisis deepened on February 12th, when Caleb Turner's brick chimney developed a crack from repeated thermal stress, allowing dangerous backdrafts of smoke and carbon monoxide into his living space during periods of high wind. The damage occurred during a particularly severe storm when cycling between extreme cold and the intense heat of a roaring fire caused the masonry to split along a mortar joint 6 feet above the firebox. Turner faced an impossible choice: continue using a compromised heating system that might poison his family, or extinguish his fire entirely and risk freezing to death in a cabin that had already proven inadequate for the extreme conditions. Rather than attempt repairs in sub-zero temperatures with materials frozen solid, Turner swallowed his professional pride and approached Lars with a request that would have seemed unthinkable months earlier. Could the Halverson family shelter his wife and 2 children until the weather moderated enough for chimney repairs? The request acknowledged not just the superior performance of the smoke attic design, but Turner's recognition that his own conventional heating system had failed when conditions exceeded its design limits. Lars accepted the refugees without hesitation, despite the strain that 4 additional people would place on his cabin's heating capacity and food supplies. The Halverson living space, originally designed for a family of 5, now housed 9 people in quarters that would have been cramped under normal circumstances. Yet the smoke attic system adapted to the increased demand with remarkable flexibility. By burning slightly larger fuel loads and extending the heating cycle through longer periods, the cabin maintained comfortable interior temperatures even with nearly double its intended occupancy. The Turner family's first night in the smoke-warmed cabin provided a dramatic education in alternative heating principles. While their own home had required constant fire tending and heavy clothing indoors, the Halverson space remained warm enough for normal indoor activities throughout the evening. Turner's children, who had grown accustomed to sleeping fully clothed under multiple blankets, marveled at the possibility of undressing for bed in a room that stayed above 50 degrees all night long. Turner's wife, a practical woman who had endured weeks of marginal heating, openly admitted that she had never experienced such consistent warmth in any frontier dwelling. The expanded household also revealed the smoke attic's secondary function as a food preservation system. Above their heads, the aromatic chamber held 6 full hams averaging 18 pounds each, 8 sides of bacon totaling nearly 60 pounds, and racks of smoked fish that represented weeks of protein for a large family. The constant low-level smoke and elevated temperatures had transformed raw meat into shelf-stable provisions that could sustain the group through extended isolation. Turner calculated that the Halverson family possessed roughly 200 pounds of preserved meat, enough to provide essential protein for their expanded household through the remainder of winter, even if no supply trains reached the settlement before spring. The contrast with neighboring families grew more pronounced as February storms continued without relief. The Sorensen cabin, built to the same specifications Turner had recommended, struggled to maintain interior temperatures above 40 degrees despite burning increasing amounts of precious firewood. Other settlement families faced similar conditions, with some resorting to burning furniture, fence rails, and even structural timbers from outbuildings to maintain minimal heat. The community's collective firewood reserves, calculated to last through a normal winter, proved woefully inadequate for the sustained extreme cold that marked the 1881 season. During the day, when wind conditions permitted, Turner studied the smoke attic system with the methodical attention of an engineer trying to understand a superior technology. He observed how the sealed ceiling created a thermal barrier that prevented heat loss to the cold roof space, how the horizontal stovepipe run captured energy that would otherwise escape directly up a vertical chimney, and how the entire attic volume functioned as a thermal battery that stored heat during active burning periods and released it slowly through the long hours between fuel additions. Most significantly, Turner began to understand how the smoke attic principle could be adapted for safer, more conventional construction. The key insight was not the smoke itself, but the concept of using the roof space as a thermal buffer zone rather than a cold void that drained heat from living areas. A properly insulated attic with sealed ceiling and strategic pipe routing could capture similar benefits without the fire and health risks associated with controlled smoke chambers above sleeping areas. The extended cohabitation also provided Turner with detailed observations about fuel consumption under real-world conditions. The Halverson cabin, heating nearly twice its intended occupancy, consumed approximately 4 cords of wood per month during the coldest periods, a rate that compared favorably to conventional cabins heating half as many people. Turner's own cabin, before the chimney failure, had burned roughly 3 cords monthly while providing inferior comfort for a smaller family. The efficiency gain represented survival margin that could mean the difference between making it through winter and facing starvation or death from exposure. As February storms gradually gave way to the longer days of early March, Turner began planning modifications to his own heating system that would incorporate lessons learned from weeks of living with smoke attic technology. He envisioned a hybrid approach that captured thermal efficiency benefits while maintaining the safety margins that conventional chimney design provided. The experience had transformed him from skeptical critic to reluctant convert, forced to acknowledge that frontier building practices could learn valuable lessons from older traditions that emphasized heat retention over rapid smoke removal. The Turner family's month-long residence in the Halverson cabin became settlement legend, providing undeniable proof that alternative heating approaches could outperform accepted frontier wisdom under the most demanding conditions. When spring thaw finally arrived and Turner could repair his chimney, he carried with him detailed plans for modifications that would make his own cabin significantly more efficient for future winters. The spring thaw of 1881 arrived later than anyone could remember, with ice jams backing up the Missouri River into April and flooding that washed away sections of railroad track from Yankton to Pierre. When supply trains finally resumed service in early May, they brought not just flour and tools, but territorial building inspectors whose reports would eventually reach the State House with recommendations about frontier construction standards. The hard winter had killed livestock, bankrupted families, and forced entire communities to reconsider basic assumptions about survival on the northern plains. As settlers emerged from their winter isolation and began assessing damage to buildings, equipment, and community morale, stories of the smoke attic's superior performance spread beyond the immediate settlement. Caleb Turner, whose professional reputation had been built on conventional chimney design, found himself in the unexpected position of advocating for alternative heating approaches that violated established building practices. His detailed documentation of temperature differences and fuel consumption rates provided quantitative proof that traditional methods could be improved through selective adoption of older European techniques. The rebuilding that began in May reflected lessons learned through months of extreme testing. Turner's own cabin repairs included a sealed plank ceiling, additional roof insulation using prairie grass and clay, and a modified stovepipe route that captured more heat before venting to the outside. While he stopped short of creating a full smoke chamber, his hybrid approach incorporated thermal buffer principles that reduced heat loss through the roof structure. Other families made similar modifications, tightening their attic spaces and adding insulation materials that had seemed unnecessary before winter taught them the true cost of heat loss. The Sorensen family rebuilt entirely, enlarging their cabin footprint from 16 by 20 feet to 18 by 24, and incorporating a sealed loft that served as both storage space and thermal barrier. Their new heating system featured a horizontal stovepipe run similar to Lars's design, though venting through a conventional chimney rather than a smoke chamber. The modifications increased construction time and material costs by roughly 30%, but the family considered this a reasonable investment against future winters that might equal or exceed the severity of 1881. Word of the settlement's heating innovations reached territorial authorities through the reports of railroad engineers and territorial surveyors who documented infrastructure damage from the hard winter. Government officials concerned about homesteader mortality and abandonment rates in the northern districts began collecting information about building practices that had proven most effective during extreme weather conditions. The smoke attic principle, despite its safety concerns, represented documented success in maintaining habitable interior conditions while consuming reasonable amounts of scarce fuel. By 1883, modified versions of Lars's thermal buffer concept had spread throughout Dakota Territory and into Minnesota settlements where Norwegian and German immigrants brought familiarity with European heating traditions. These adaptations typically featured insulated attic spaces with sealed ceilings and strategic pipe routing, capturing efficiency benefits without the fire and health risks of actual smoke chambers. Territorial building guidelines began recommending sealed attics and thermal buffer zones for cabins in regions subject to extended periods of sub-zero temperatures. The long-term legacy of the smoke attic experiment appeared most clearly in the detailed records kept by Ellen Halverson Johnson, Lars's granddaughter, who grew up hearing precise accounts of the winter that changed local building practices. As a school teacher with access to territorial records and family documents, Ellen documented fuel consumption figures, temperature measurements, and survival outcomes that provided historical evidence for heating system effectiveness. Her records showed that families using thermal buffer principles averaged 30 to 40% lower fuel consumption than conventional heating systems while maintaining superior interior comfort. Ellen's documentation proved especially valuable when territorial historians began collecting accounts of the hard winter for official records. Her grandfather's careful measurements and Turner's engineering observations provided quantitative data that elevated frontier innovation beyond folklore into documented technical achievement. The smoke attic story became a case study in adaptive building practices that helped later settlers survive similar extreme weather events. The scientific principles underlying Lars's intuitive design became clearer as territorial engineers studied heating efficiency in frontier buildings. The smoke attic had functioned as an early version of what later building science would call a thermal envelope, creating a buffer zone that reduced heat loss through the building's largest surface area. The sealed ceiling prevented heated air from escaping directly to the cold roof space, while the warm attic air reduced conductive heat loss through the structural elements. Modern analysis would calculate the system's effective insulation value at roughly R15 compared to R3 for conventional frontier roof assemblies. By the 1890s, when statehood brought formal building codes to Dakota Territory, smoke chambers had been prohibited for safety reasons, but thermal buffer zones and insulated attics had become standard recommendations for cold climate construction. The evolution from Lars's original design to safer adaptations demonstrated how frontier innovation could influence broader building practices while acknowledging legitimate safety concerns about indoor smoke exposure and fire risk. Ellen preserved the original smoke-blackened rafters from her grandfather's cabin when the family built a larger house in 1895, displaying them in the local historical society as artifacts of successful frontier adaptation. The preserved timbers, darkened by years of controlled smoke exposure, provided physical evidence of heating methods that had kept families alive during one of the territory's most severe winters. Visitors could see how the wood had been impregnated with smoke and creosote, creating a preservation effect similar to that achieved in medieval European buildings with smoke-filled roof spaces. The broader lesson of the smoke attic extended beyond heating technology to encompass principles of frontier survival that valued practical results over conventional wisdom. Lars Halvorsen had succeeded not by rejecting all established practices, but by selectively adapting older techniques to new conditions, creating hybrid solutions that addressed specific environmental challenges. His willingness to appear foolish in pursuit of better performance had established a model for frontier innovation that influenced building practices across the northern plains. The transformation of one family's odd heating experiment into territorial building policy demonstrated how frontier conditions could accelerate the adoption of superior technologies, even when those technologies challenged established professional practices and social expectations.